Ahoy there, my seafaring friends, I'm Captain Titanic. You may have heard that 14 years before the Titanic set sail, the disaster was foretold in a book. Is that true? Well, while there was indeed a book with similarities, the reality is that it was not a prophecy. Let me explain. The Wreck of the Titan was written by Morgan Robertson in 1898, and it describes a British ship named the Titan, the largest vessel afloat, proclaimed unsinkable, with a lack of lifeboats, and in mid-April it strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks with a large loss of life. Sound familiar? But Robertson never called himself a prophet. He was simply an American author and an experienced sailor who knew a lot about ships. More importantly, there were large differences from the book and the actual disaster. For example, Robertson's ship has sails and was on its third, not maiden, voyage, and it runs aground on top of the iceberg. So ultimately it cannot really be called a prophecy. There is, however, much more to this fascinating story, including a modern-day twist, as Titanic researcher Dan Parks explained in the following more in-depth video.
So yes, as Captain Titanic says, Morgan Robertson's 1898 book Futility, or Wreck of the Titan, does share some fascinating similarities to the 1912 disaster. Robertson's technical description of the fictional ship aligns quite closely to the Titanic in terms of its length, tonnage and watertight compartments, but there are some logical reasons for this. Firstly, Morgan was the son of a ship captain, and he himself went to sea, eventually achieving the rank of first mate. When he turned to writing for employment, it's not surprising that he used his maritime background for inspiration. The name Titan was a popular name for a ship at the time, especially one claiming to be the largest. In fact, there are no fewer than 3 other accounts of actual vessels with the name Titania that were involved in disasters on the North Atlantic, possibly involving ice, and many years before Robertson penned Futility, revealing that he may well have been inspired by such news reports. Indeed, in a story he called The Pirates, which is often included with Futility, Robertson also names the ship Gigantea, a large vessel with similar imposing dimensions as his other fictional ship. Robertson clearly knew turn-of-the-century shipbuilding trends and made some quite obvious guesses when it came to a future ship's technical specifications. It's perhaps the same as modern films, which are based on the use of new technology, for example computers, robots, space travel, and these can often explore potential hazards or disasters. Secondly, we must consider the differences, and when you read the book, what strikes you the most are the myriad of key differences that actually reveals the story to be nothing like the Titanic at all. For example, Robertson's ship has 2 sails and was on its third, not maiden voyage, and it's also filled to capacity, unlike the Titanic, which was not sailing anywhere near its potential capacity. Robertson's Titan also accidentally strikes and splits in half another vessel long before it even encounters the iceberg, and then when the iceberg is spotted, it's during a heavy fog, while on the night of the Titanic it was completely clear. Instead of an iceberg collision on her starboard side, the Titan runs up onto a gradual slope of ice until it's almost completely out of the water, before sliding back into the sea and sinking. Of the 3,000 passengers who sailed on the Titan, only 13 survived, a survival rate of less than 1%, or specifically 0.43%, compared to 712 of Titanic's 2,208 surviving, a 32% survival rate, or 32 times better than that of the Titan. Additionally, the book is not about the ship specifically. It's simply a narrative device that actually focuses on a Navy officer, his religious enlightenment, and has both romance and a frankly bizarre action sequence involving fighting a polar bear and improbably killing it while on an iceberg, all in an effort to protect a small girl. It's fanciful fiction, and it bears no similarity at all to the Titanic narrative. Thirdly, Robertson never claimed to be a prophet or a psychic, and his work is certainly not in the style of a prophecy such as Nostradamus. He purely had an interest in maritime advancement. In fact, according to a Time magazine article dated April 14, 2012, and entitled "Author Predicts Titanic Sinking 14 Years Earlier," Robertson is quoted post-Titanic disaster as denying being a clairvoyant, simply saying, "No, I know what I'm writing about, that's all." That he was not a prophet is seen in a case in point. In 1995, he wrote another book entitled The Submarine Destroyer, in which he describes the use of a periscope, which led him to believe, erroneously, that he was an inventor of the periscope concept, although actually it had been invented several years earlier. But this reveals his keen interest in technological trends. As a postscript, that his interest was more of a monetary nature, suggested by the 1912 post-Titanic reprinting of his Titan book, in which he changed some details, specifically changing the ship's weight and horsepower to more closely match the real ship, clearly realizing that there was profitability in the similarity. Even more obviously, he changed the 1898 title from Futility to the more obvious The Wreck of the Titan. As for Morgan himself, he died at the relatively young age of 53 in 1915, only 3 years after the Titanic disaster. The cause was most likely heart disease. He was found in his hotel room, with the contemporary New York Times reporting that he was rather strangely found in a standing position, and drugs were found nearby, and hence it could well have been an overdose. Either way, having never really succeeded as an author, in fact he described himself as broke, his death was a sad end, especially as his book would later take on a life of its own. While on the subject, there is another not as well known example of foreshadowing by an author that is even earlier than Robertson. The British journalist William Stead wrote a short story in 1886, 26 years before Titanic, entitled "How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor," and it details an unnamed ship on the Atlantic that has insufficient lifeboats for all on board, and which collides with another vessel in fog, resulting in a high death toll. There is no iceberg involved, but there are scenes of passengers rushing lifeboats and officers resorting to guns to stop lifeboats being swamped. It's a classic example of an anecdotal cautionary tale, with Stead writing at the very end to make his point clear, as a bracketed note from the editor, "This is exactly what might take place and will take place if liners are sent to sea short of boats." What makes Stead's account of particular note is that in April 1912 he boarded the Titanic, invited by the US President no less, to a peace congress at Carnegie Hall, which of course he would never make, as he was one of the almost 1,500 lost in the sinking. What makes this all the more interesting is that he was also a spiritualist who, it has been claimed, foretold he would die from either a lynching or drowning. However, Stead was a prolific author and editor of a variety of publications for various causes, so it's not particularly impressive to find one cautionary tale about a ship lacking lifeboats, as this was a widespread industry issue not unique to Titanic, while the specific details are too ambiguous and certainly do not align exactly with the Titanic disaster. But what both of these stories reveal is that in the late 19th century, authors were beginning to acknowledge the dangers of modern technology and that regulations were not remaining in step with advances. It has to be remembered that the time leading up to the Titanic, travelling by ever-increasing larger ocean vessels was the predominant form of travel, until flight gradually took over after the First World War. So one does not need to be a psychic to realise that such increase in size and lack of lifeboat regulation would one day end in disaster. Going back to Morgan Robertson and the Titan, in a rather sad twist to her story, in June 2023 a submarine by the very name of the Titan, operated by OceanGate, imploded while on a mission to explore the wreck of the Titanic, with the loss of all 5 on board. So Morgan's use of the name Titan and curiously his interest in submersibles sadly converged once again. And just as with the stories by Robertson instead, it looks like the story of the Titan submersible will also become a cautionary tale for our modern age.
I hope you enjoyed this journey to discover facts rather than fiction. Until next time, my seafaring friends, it's bon voyage.